642 galactic species raised their hands, or their tentacles, or their bioluminescent fins, or whatever appendage their biology had gifted them, and agreed, without any visible guilt, that humanity had to go. The Galactic Conclave, that ancient and supposedly wise body of interstellar civilizations, had debated the matter for exactly 11 days. 11 days to decide the fate of a species that had been among them for less than 2 centuries. 11 days to look at 8 billion people and say, "You are too dangerous, too loud, too unpredictable, and too much trouble to keep around." The formal charge, read aloud in the Great Hall of Velthar Station by the Conclave's High Speaker, a towering Dreshkai elder named Voss, was simple enough. Humanity posed an existential threat to galactic stability. The humans had, in the span of just 170 years of spaceflight, managed to make enemies of 3 major powers, accidentally ignite a trade war between the Sulhuri and the Minnock, introduce 17 invasive biological species to worlds that had taken millions of years to reach ecological balance, and, most damning of all, build a weapons program that no other species had managed to develop in less than 1,000 years of technological growth. They were not wrong, exactly. Humans had always been fast. Too fast, some said. Where other species took centuries to develop interstellar drives, humanity had done it in 80 years, driven by a combination of desperation, rivalry between nations, and a stubborn refusal to accept that some things simply could not be done quickly. Where other species spent generations debating the ethics of terraforming, humans had already broken ground on 3 moons before the philosophical committees had finished their first draft of recommendations. But none of that fully explained what happened next. The conclave did not merely vote to restrict humanity's access to certain technologies, or to place them under observation, or to appoint a council of oversight. They voted to exile them, to take the 31 gates that connected human space to the rest of the galaxy, those shimmering, massive structures of ancient precursor engineering that allowed faster-than-light travel, and to lock every single one of them. Ambassador Sarah Lynn stood in the hall and listened to the decision being read. She was 43 years old, a career diplomat who had spent 20 years working to build bridges between humanity and the species that surrounded them. She had friends among the Sulhuri. She had once shared a meal, a strange and somewhat alarming meal, but a meal, with a Dreshkai elder. She believed, genuinely and without any performance of it, that humanity and the galactic community could find a way to coexist. She had spent 2 decades trying to prove it. When the vote was announced, she did not cry. She did not shout. She stood very still for a long moment, and then she turned to the young aide standing beside her, a nervous man named Cho who was holding a data pad so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, and she said, very quietly, "Send the signal. All gates. Authorization Lin 7. Cho blinked. "Ambassador, the vote only authorizes the conclave to lock the gates from—" "I know what the vote authorizes," she said. "Send the signal." He sent it. What the conclave had planned was a ceremonial locking, a formal closure of the gates from their side, with humanity's ships corralled back into their own systems, their exploration rights revoked, their trade routes severed. It was meant to be humiliating, a public demonstration of power, the galaxy watching as humanity was put in a box and the lid closed. What they had not counted on was that humanity would close the box from the inside. Sarah Lynn's signal did not just lock the gates. It activated a set of protocols that human engineers had spent 11 years quietly building into the gate maintenance systems. Protocols that, once triggered, would physically seal each gate from the human side, encrypt the reopening codes using a cipher architecture that no known alien computational system could break, and then distribute fragments of those codes across 17 different locations in human space, none of which were listed in any database the conclave had access to. They had planned for this. Not this exact scenario. They had hoped it would never be needed. But humans, in the long tradition of humans everywhere, had read the room, seen which way the wind was blowing, and built a contingency. The conclave finished reading the verdict. The hall buzzed with the sounds of 642 species processing the moment. There was, among many of them, something that functioned very much like satisfaction. The problem, they believed, had been solved. High Speaker Voss looked down at Ambassador Lin and said, in a tone that was meant to be merciful, Your people will be permitted to keep all currently inhabited worlds. You will not be harmed. You will simply be contained. Sarah Lynn nodded slowly. That's very kind of you, she said. I should mention, the gates are already closed. From our side, you won't be opening them again without our help. Silence fell in the hall with the weight of something very large falling from a very great height. Voss stared at her. That is not possible. The gate systems are precursor architecture. No species has ever successfully modified. We did, she said simply. We're humans. We do things fast. She picked up her bag from the floor beside her chair. I'll be returning to my ship now. I expect you'll have a great many things to discuss. Take your time. We have plenty of it. She walked out of the hall of the Galactic Conclave for the last time. Behind her, the silence broke into something that had no easy translation in any human language. A sound made by 642 different species simultaneously realizing that the thing they had just done might not have been as clever as they thought. Back in human space, the news traveled quickly. It always did. People gathered around screens in homes and bars and public squares on 47 worlds and listened as the story came through. The Conclave had voted to exile them, and humanity had responded by sealing the exits and keeping the keys. The reactions were complicated. There was anger, of course. There was fear. There were people who thought Sarah Lynn had made a terrible mistake, that they should have negotiated, that they should have fought the vote through legal channels, that sealing the gates was an act of provocation that would bring consequences they weren't prepared for. But there was also something else, something quieter and harder to name, a kind of grim, stubborn pride that ran very deep in human bones. The galaxy had tried to put them away, and they had, in the time-honored human fashion, refused to cooperate. They were locked in. Yes, but so was everything they had ever built. Every ship, every station, every colony, every research program, every factory and farm and laboratory and school. 31 systems, hundreds of habitable worlds, 8 billion people, and a civilization that had learned, through long and often painful experience, how to do a great many things very quickly. They were not afraid of being alone. They had been alone before. The whole long history of humanity on Earth had been a story of alone, of a single species on a single planet, looking up at the stars and wondering and working and refusing to stop until they finally reached them. They could do it again. They would do it differently this time. And the galaxy, shut out beyond those sealed gates, had no idea what they had just set in motion. Not peaceful. There is a difference, but quiet. In the way that a room goes quiet after a door is slammed and both sides are still catching their breath. The Galactic Conclave issued 3 formal statements demanding that humanity reopen the gates for inspection. Humanity did not respond. The Conclave sent 2 unmanned probe ships toward the sealed gate apertures to attempt a forced interface with the locking mechanisms. Both probes were fried by a pulse system that nobody on the Conclave side had known existed. The Conclave sent a strongly worded diplomatic message through a long-range frequency that human ships still monitored. The message explained, at some length, that what humanity was doing was illegal under the Conclave Charter. Humanity sent back a single line. We are no longer members of the Conclave. The Charter does not apply. That exchange was recorded and debated for months in the halls of the Conclave. Legal scholars among a dozen species produced papers analyzing whether a species that had been exiled could simultaneously resign from the body that exiled them, and whether the resignation was therefore retroactive, and whether that changed the legal status of the exile itself. It was the kind of question that academic bodies found fascinating and that solved absolutely nothing in practical terms. In human space, practical terms were exactly what people were focused on. The exile had not been without pain. There were supply chains that had depended on galactic trade routes, specialized minerals from Sulhuri mining operations, certain biological compounds produced only on Dreshkai agricultural worlds, pharmaceutical precursors that human colonies in the outer systems had relied on. Cutting those connections hurt. There were shortages in the first year, rationing on 7 colonies, a genuine crisis on the research station at Kepler's Rest, where a batch of medical synthesizers failed and the replacement components had previously been sourced from a manufacturer on the other side of a gate that was now sealed. People died because of the exile. Not many. Not the catastrophic numbers that the most frightened voices had predicted. But some. And Sarah Lynn, who had returned to Earth and accepted a position on the newly formed Emergency Continuity Council, kept a private record of every name. It was the kind of thing she did. It was the kind of person she had always been. Someone who understood that every decision made at the level of civilizations was also made at the level of individual human lives, and that the two scales had to be held in mind at the same time, always. The council worked fast. They had to. The immediate problems were solvable if you were willing to apply enough human ingenuity and enough human stubbornness to them. The mineral shortages pushed 3 different university research programs into overdrive, and within 8 months, 2 of them had developed viable synthetic substitutes that were, in several respects, superior to the original. The medical crisis at Kepler's Rest became the catalyst for a new domestic manufacturing program that, within 2 years, had made human space entirely self-sufficient in medical-grade synthesis components for the first time in its history. Every shortage became a project. Every gap in capability became a research priority. The exile that was meant to diminish humanity was instead doing something that those who voted for it had fundamentally failed to anticipate. It was focusing them. The constant, low-level friction of dealing with the galactic community, the endless negotiations, the cultural misunderstandings, the conclave regulations that governed everything from ship drive emissions to approved methods of planetary resource extraction, was gone. Humanity had only themselves to answer to now. And in that absence of external constraint, they moved with a speed that would have alarmed even their closest former allies. The defense programs were the most dramatic example. In the years before the exile, human military development had been carefully watched and frequently restricted by conclave oversight. Several technologies had been flagged as destabilizing and placed under formal prohibition. With the gates closed and the oversight committees dissolved, those restrictions ceased to exist. Human engineers, scientists, and military planners, people who had spent years watching their best ideas get buried in regulatory review, picked up their work and continued it. Within 3 years, the human defense fleet had doubled in size. Within 5, it had tripled, equipped with drive systems and weapons architectures that bore no resemblance to anything in the Conclave's records of human military capability. Because those records were 5 years out of date, and humanity had not been idle. None of this was known to the Conclave. The gates were sealed. No spy ships penetrated human space. They had tried twice more after the probe incidents, and both attempts ended with the spy ships impounded and their crews politely but firmly returned to the nearest gate with a message explaining that the next attempt would result in the ship being retained permanently as a study subject. The Conclave filed formal protests. Humanity did not acknowledge them. What the Conclave did begin to notice, in those first years, was something subtler than a military buildup. It was the absence of something they had not known they relied on until it was gone. Humans, in the centuries before the exile, had served a particular and underappreciated function in the galactic community. They were, by nature and by habit, fixers. Not always graceful fixers. Not always invited fixers. But when a problem arose that was strange or urgent or required someone to do something that no established protocol covered, it was often a human crew that ended up doing it, because humans were the species most likely to look at an impossible situation and say, well, let's try this and see what happens. The Sulhuri, whose civilization was ancient and proud and built on elaborate systems of social hierarchy, had relied on human negotiators more than they had ever admitted, because humans had no stake in Sulhuri internal politics and could therefore say things that no Sulhuri diplomat could say without causing an interstellar incident. The Minnock, whose engineering was extraordinary but whose approach to novel problems was conservative to the point of paralysis, had routinely contracted human consulting firms to handle the parts of a project that fell outside established parameters. Even the Dreshkai, who had voted for the exile with the most certainty of any major power, had in the past 15 years quietly used human biological research to inform 3 separate planetary restoration projects on worlds they were struggling to rehabilitate. None of them had thought of these things as dependencies. They were just arrangements. Convenient ones, certainly, but nothing structural, nothing important. In the second year after the exile, the Minnock attempted to complete a deep space relay station that had been under construction for 11 years. The final phase required an interface solution that their engineers had been unable to crack. They had previously hired a human firm to consult on it. The human firm was, of course, no longer available. The project stalled. It was still stalled 18 months later, when a crisis in the outer Minic territories required rapid communication through a relay network that wasn't fully operational. In the third year, a biological containment failure on a Sulhuri agricultural world threatened to spread a modified crop pathogen across 3 connected systems. The Sulhuri Containment Authority spent 6 weeks trying to develop a response protocol before someone noted, privately, that the last time something like this had happened, an incident on the border world of Chess Minor, 12 years earlier. The solution had been found by a team that had included 2 human xenobiologists who had brought an approach the Sulhuri teams had never considered. There were no human xenobiologists to call. The gates were closed. The pathogen spread to 2 systems before it was contained, at a cost and lost crops that sent food prices across the Sulhuri cooperative into crisis for a full growing season. These were not catastrophes. The galaxy did not collapse. Life went on, as it does. But a pattern was forming, quiet and accumulating, in the spaces where humanity used to be. The species of the conclave were beginning to discover that the problem they had voted to remove had also been, in ways they had never properly cataloged, a resource they had never properly valued. In the deep archives of the conclave's administrative center on Valethar Station, a junior analyst named Thessaly, a young Dreshkai on her first rotation in the Strategic Assessment Division, began compiling a report. She was thorough and careful and had been trained to look at data without assumptions. She titled it, in the dry language of bureaucratic assessment, Economic and Operational Impact Assessment, Post-Exile Human Space Absence, Year 3. When she finished it and sent it up the chain to her supervisors, it was classified immediately. Her supervisors read it, went very quiet, and sent it further up the chain. It did not stay classified for long. Very little does, when the information is alarming enough. The report that Thessaly wrote was called, by those who read it in the months after it was declassified, simply the Absence Study. It ran to 412 pages and examined, with the methodical patience of someone who had grown up in a culture that revered careful documentation, every measurable impact of the human exile on the galactic economy, the galactic defense network, galactic scientific output, and galactic crisis response capacity over the 3 years since the gates closed. The numbers were not comfortable reading. Human firms and consultants, before the exile, had held contracts across 93 species territories. Some of those contracts had been large and visible, the kind that showed up in trade statistics and economic reports. Many had been small, specialized, and unremarked upon. A human biosystems engineer contracted to maintain life support on a Velthari deep space habitat. A human translation team retained by a Minic court for cross-cultural arbitration. A human salvage company that specialized in recovering derelict ships from deep space drift corridors where no other crew would operate because the conditions were too unpredictable. These small contracts, Thessaly's report noted, had been running quietly in the background of galactic commerce for over 100 years. Their value had never been properly aggregated. When you aggregated them, the total was astonishing. Human-developed technologies, licensed before the exile, powered or partially powered infrastructure across 62 separate species territorial systems. Drive components, medical scanner arrays, atmospheric processing systems, communications encryption architectures. Some of these had been manufactured under license by non-human companies, but the foundational designs were human, and the licensing payments had stopped when the gates closed, because nobody had thought to establish an escrow arrangement, and because the Conclave's legal division had been, at the time of the exile, more focused on the political dimensions of the vote than the commercial ones. The licenses had lapsed. Replacement designs either did not exist or existed only as partially developed alternatives that required years of additional work to be viable. The scientific data was perhaps most striking of all. Humanity, Thessaly's report noted, had published more novel research findings in the past century than any other species of equivalent technological age. They had not done so because they were smarter, the report was careful about this point, but because they worked differently. Most species research institutions were organized around long-term stability and incremental progress. They were built to produce reliable results over centuries. Human research institutions, shaped by a species that had never stopped expecting that they might not get centuries, were organized around speed and willingness to fail publicly and learn from the failure. The rate of novel discovery this produced was, by standard galactic metrics, abnormal. The number of research breakthroughs in fields ranging from materials science to xenobiology to quantum communications that had originated in human laboratories and then been built upon by researchers across the galaxy, sometimes without full credit to the source, was considerably larger than anyone in the conclave had previously bothered to count. Thessaly counted them. The number occupied 3 full pages of appendix. The report did not make political recommendations. Thessaly was a junior analyst and understood her role precisely enough to present data and not to tell the High Council what to do about it. But the data spoke clearly enough on its own. The Exile had not removed a problem. It had removed a pillar. And the gallery of species who had gathered to watch it fall were now standing in a structure that was, in certain important ways, creaking. High Speaker Voss retired 6 months after the report was declassified, citing health reasons. His successor, a Sulhuri diplomat named Quirin OSS who had voted against the Exile, one of only 42 species representatives who had, called an emergency session of the Conclave's Economic Affairs Committee. The session lasted 4 days. At the end of it, a formal delegation request was drafted. The Conclave wished to open negotiations with the human government regarding conditions for gate reopening. The message was sent through the long-range frequency that still connected to human monitoring systems. It was acknowledged within 48 hours. The response was 3 sentences long. The first sentence confirmed that humanity had received the message. The second sentence noted that humanity was prepared to discuss the matter. The third sentence specified the terms under which that discussion could begin. The negotiations would take place on human soil, in a human-administered facility, under human rules of procedure, with the full conclave delegation required to travel to human space through a single gate that would be opened for that purpose and closed again the moment the delegation had passed through. The conclave deliberated for 2 weeks before agreeing. There were voices who called it humiliating. There were voices who pointed out that they didn't have much of an alternative. The voices who pointed out the lack of alternative were, ultimately, louder. The delegation that arrived at the human border station of New Carthage was one of the largest diplomatic assemblages in galactic history. 47 species, 312 delegates, and approximately 400 support staff, media representatives, and observers. They came through the gate in careful sequence, each ship logged and cleared by human customs officers who were polite and efficient and absolutely unhurried, and who turned away 2 Dreshkai ships that had arrived without the required advance clearance with the pleasant and unmovable patience of people who had nowhere in particular to be. What they saw at New Carthage was not what most of them had expected. They had expected, some of them, the ones who had told themselves comfortable stories, to find a diminished civilization. Humans cut off from galactic trade and technology for 7 years should have been struggling, should have shown signs of regression, of desperate shortages, of a people who had learned, the hard way, why isolation was not a viable option for a species of their level. What they found was a station 3 times the size of the one recorded in their most recent survey data. New Carthage had been a mid-sized commercial hub 7 years ago. It was now an enormous, humming complex of docks and habitation rings and manufacturing bays, and what appeared to be a research facility of considerable scale, all connected by transit systems that ran with a precision and speed that made several of the delegates' engineers request, quietly, to speak with whoever had designed the transit architecture. The human ships docked alongside them were, to those who knew what to look for, quietly alarming. Not because they were visibly military, most of them were not, but because the drive signatures were wrong. Not wrong in a broken way. Wrong in the way that a design is wrong when it has moved significantly beyond what you thought was possible. A Minnick drive engineer named Sketh Vorel, assigned to the delegation as a technical advisor, spent 3 hours analyzing the passive emissions from a human freighter docked 2 berths over, and then wrote a memo to the delegation's chief technical officer that read, in its entirety, "We have a serious problem. They have not been standing still." The opening session of negotiations was held in a large, simply furnished hall in the main administrative wing of New Carthage. Sarah Lynn led the human delegation. She was 50 years old now, and looked it, and wore it with the particular ease of someone who had long stopped caring about appearances and started caring entirely about outcomes. Beside her sat a general named Costa Merrick, who said almost nothing during the first day and watched the conclave delegates with the quiet attention of a person who is cataloging information for later use. Quirin OSS opened for the conclave. She was careful and gracious and chose her words with the skill of someone who had spent her career navigating the politics of a body with 642 members. She spoke of mutual benefit. She spoke of the value of connection. She spoke about how the exile had perhaps been, in retrospect, an overcorrection, and how the conclave was prepared to revisit the legal frameworks that had governed human space in order to ensure a more equitable arrangement going forward. Sarah Lynn listened to all of it without interrupting. When Quirin OSS finished, there was a short silence. Then Lynn put her hands flat on the table and said, in the calm, direct way that had become something of a legend in diplomatic circles, "Ambassador OSS, I want to be honest with you about something. We don't need the gates open. We would like them open for reasons that benefit both of us, and I think we can reach an agreement that is genuinely good for everyone. But I want you to understand the position you are negotiating from. You are not here because we are struggling. You are here because you are." The hall was very quiet. "Let's talk," Lynn said, "about what that agreement looks like." The negotiations lasted 61 days. 61 days in a station that never fully slept, where the lighting cycled through a rhythm calibrated to human biology rather than any of the dozens of biological clocks represented in the conclave delegation, where the food available in the common areas was human food and the ambient temperature was human comfortable, and every small logistical detail of the environment had been arranged, not aggressively but simply and without apology, around the needs and preferences of the species that lived there. It was not the first time a conclave delegation had negotiated on another species' ground, but it was the first time many of the delegates had found themselves thinking, somewhere around the third week, that this was what it felt like to be the guest rather than the host. The difference was not comfortable. Sarah Lynn's negotiating team had spent 2 years preparing for this. Not because they had known the conclave would come, they hadn't known that with any certainty, but because someone had to prepare for it, and Lynn was the kind of person who made sure that someone did. The documents they put on the table were precise, comprehensive, and written in a way that was not aggressive, but was also not soft. They knew exactly what they wanted. They knew exactly what they would accept as a minimum. And they knew, from a careful analysis of Thessali's report and several other datasets that human intelligence had compiled from long-range observation of galactic commerce over the 7 years of exile, what the conclave needed badly enough to pay for. The first thing humanity wanted was recognition. Not the warm, vague kind. A formal revision to the conclave charter that acknowledged human space as a sovereign peer entity rather than a member subject to conclave jurisdiction. The exile had effectively made them sovereign already, in practice. They wanted it acknowledged in law, because laws matter for the long term even when practice has moved past them. The second thing was accountability. A formal inquiry, to be conducted by an independent panel with human representation, into the process by which the exile vote had been conducted and the evidence on which it was based. Several of the charges in the original indictment had been overstated. Some had been outright fabricated by species who had economic interests in removing human competition from certain trade sectors, and at least one. The claim that humanity had deliberately engineered the trade war between the Sulhuri and the Minnock had been a lie told by a Dreshkai commercial faction to protect a monopoly on certain rare element markets. Human intelligence had documentation. A great deal of documentation. When the documentation was placed in front of the conclave delegation, the session paused for 48 hours while Quirin OSS and her team made several urgent communications to their respective governments. 2 of the species' representatives requested permission to withdraw from the delegation entirely. It was not granted. General Costa Merrick, who had been quiet through most of the sessions, said nothing during this period, but was observed to be, for the first time, smiling slightly. The third thing humanity wanted was simple in its statement and significant in its implications: veto rights. Any future action taken by the conclave that affected human space or human citizens required human concurrence, not majority approval of the conclave. Human concurrence specifically. 1 vote, held by the human representative, that could stop any resolution that humanity considered contrary to its interests. This last demand produced the longest single debate of the negotiations. It ran for 9 days, with sessions sometimes stretching past what any of the non-human delegates would have considered reasonable hours, sustained by the human staff's willingness to keep providing food and the human negotiators' willingness to keep talking. Quirin OSS made 4 separate arguments against the veto provision. Lin answered each one without raising her voice and without retreating from the position. On the 5th attempt, OSS shifted tactics and asked, with genuine curiosity more than diplomatic strategy, "Why? You said yourself that you don't need the gates. You have built something remarkable here in 7 years. You could remain as you are. Why do you want to return to a community that treated you this way?" Sarah Lynn was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of pause that was not hesitation but thought, the pause of someone who had the answer and was choosing how to give it. "Because we are not actually better off alone," she said. "We are sufficient alone. We have survived, and more than survived, and the people who told us we couldn't are wrong, and we needed to prove that, and we have. But sufficient is not the same as flourishing. We built something good here in 7 years of necessity. Imagine what we could build in 7 years of cooperation, if the cooperation was built on honest terms." She looked around the table. "We don't want to rule the galaxy. We don't want to punish anyone for what was done. We want to be part of something larger than ourselves, the way we always did. We just want to do it as equals. We are not asking for more than that, but we will not accept less." Quirin OSS looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "I voted against the exile. I want you to know that." "I know," Lin said. "It's in the record. It was one of the first things I checked 7 years ago when I was trying to figure out who we might be able to talk to." The agreement was signed on the 61st day. The formal name was the New Carthage Compact, and it was 43 pages long and had been argued over sentence by sentence and was, in the judgment of every legal analyst who later studied it, one of the most precisely written diplomatic documents in galactic history, because the people who wrote it had learned, the hard way, what happened when the terms were not clear. The veto provision was in it. So was the sovereignty recognition. So was the accountability inquiry, which would go on to run for 3 years and result in the expulsion of 2 conclave member species for deliberate evidence fabrication, the overturning of the exile resolution in its entirety, and formal apologies from 14 of the species that had voted for it. Some grudging, some genuine, all recorded in the permanent archive of the conclave's proceedings, where they would remain for as long as the conclave existed. The first gate opened on a clear morning at New Carthage, ship time, with a crowd gathered on the observation deck of the main ring. Ships began moving through in both directions within the hour, carefully, with full customs procedures on both sides, because the new arrangement had agreed protocols that neither party would shortcut. On the galactic side, a Minic engineering team arrived within a week, carrying a request to consult with human engineers about the drive signature that Sketh Vorel had analyzed from the freighter. They paid for the consultation. The rate was not cheap. They paid it without complaint, because the alternative was to spend another 4 years developing an inferior version of what the humans had already built. On the human side, several years' worth of pent-up curiosity poured outward through the gates as researchers, traders, and explorers who had spent the exile years in productive but constrained circumstances discovered that they could move freely again. New scientific partnerships formed within months. An economic relationship between human manufacturing and Sulhuri raw material extraction, restructured from the ground up on fairer terms than the previous one had ever offered, became one of the most productive trade arrangements in the outer sectors within 5 years. Thessali, the young Dreshkai analyst whose report had started the chain of events that led to the negotiations, was promoted 4 times in the 3 years following the signing. She eventually became the Dreshkai's chief representative to the Joint Human Conclave Scientific Exchange Program, a position she held for 20 years and described, in a memoir she wrote after her retirement, as the best work of her life. Sarah Lynn stepped down from public service 2 years after the signing. She was 52, and she was tired, and she had done what she had gone into the hall on Vailthar Station to do, even if the path to doing it had taken 7 unexpected years. She returned to Earth and grew a garden and wrote long letters to people she had met across the galaxy during her career. She remained, for the rest of her life, something that she had always been and that the exile had not touched. Someone who believed that connection was worth the work of building it on honest terms, and that the work was always possible, no matter how many doors had been slammed. The galaxy did not forget what had happened. Civilizations rarely do, when the lesson is expensive enough. The exile was taught in schools across dozens of species' educational systems for generations, not as a story about human defiance, though it was that, and not as a story about galactic failure, though it was that too. It was taught, when it was taught well, as a story about